Right, ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to the Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland. And any regular listener knows who I have on as my guest. Once you hear her, I'm sorry, listener. If you see her, of course, if you're watching now, and again, there'll be a YouTube video up of the interview a little bit later, plus the audio podcast. And sometimes I'm a professor. People say to me, "Louis, podcasts are audio." Well, I've seen where they say video podcast, so I don't know. I don't know. I'm an old guy. I'll use that as my explanation. I have with me as my guest Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess. You've heard her talk numerous times with me about The Cat I Never Named, a true story of love, war, and survival. And I love Professor Amra Sabic-El-Rayess. Welcome back.
Thank you, Louis, for having me back, and I will reciprocate that love. And as I said, off camera when connecting, we connected first during the pandemic in this virtual world.
Yeah.
I feel a true, genuine sense of connection with you, and speaking with you for me is a very intimate act in many ways, because I feel I can open my heart to you and talk about the work that I do in the most genuine way, even though we're on air, even though we're in a radio show. So thank you for inviting me.
It's truly my honor. As I said, I feel the same. We've connected and we've been able to connect off air. You're just amazing in the work that you do. We've got to talk about your background and as a victim of genocide, take us back. Before I get too wordy, take us back, Professor.
I was only 16 when Serb forces besieged my hometown of Bihać in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the aggressor in that war was Serbia, a neighboring Serbia that had the military power and supported local Serb forces in Bosnia to initiate ethnic cleansing, persecution, attempts of eradication. Ultimately, I refer to all of those acts of violence as Bosnian genocide, where Bosnian Muslims like myself, Bosniaks, were the primary target. I have to say, I didn't believe that just talking about hating Muslims, which was the primary narrative for years prior to the war, would ultimately culminate in an actual direct act of violence against me and my people. I always wondered, why would somebody want to kill me? I play volleyball. I'm a straight A student. I do everything right. I listen to my parents. And as a kid at the time, I thought that would protect me. But really, no society can be protected against normalized hate. And ultimately, if hate is normalized in terms of stories and narratives that are endorsed, it will lead to direct violence on the streets.
And then as it worsened, tell us, as things worsened for you and your family.
Well, it started in 1992, and I'll share a story of the very first day of bombing that transformed me. I mean, each hour and every day of surviving genocide transforms you in some way, and is a lesson in other ways. But on the very first day of bombing, my family didn't have a basement in our house, so we thought we should be in the basement to protect ourselves so that we're not directly exposed to bombs by the windows. Our house had lots of windows. My parents liked a light in the house, so they never built a basement. They didn't anticipate we would need one to hide in. So we went into a neighbor's house a few blocks away, and we hid in the basement with several other families. The basement was only one room. We stayed there for days, and eventually the bombing started. We knew the siege started. We expected Serb forces to march into the city and kill us all. We had no weapons to defend ourselves. We had no military, aside from people having their individual personal weapons, which was very rare in those days, certainly in Bosnia. And on the first day of bombing, after a few hours of bombs in the city being shelled, my younger brother Dino and I decided we would actually go back to our house because the bombing stopped for a few minutes and we thought, oh, the war is over. We didn't know better. My parents were focused on helping people whose houses were destroyed. And so for a moment, they were not paying attention to us. And Dino and I walked back to our house, and it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful sunny day in June of 1992. We ran into four of my girlfriends. They were so excited to see us, and they said, "Oh, come play with us. Let's hang out. See, the war is over. Bombing stopped. We couldn't hear any shelling even in the distance." And in that moment, Dino and I heard our cat, and our cat wasn't our cat for a long time. She actually came days prior to that with refugees into our city. And in The Cat I Never Named, my memoir, I talk about how I encountered her first time. And she decided to follow my dad and me home, and adopted herself into our family. But she didn't want to go to the basement with us. She stayed in our house. And so Dino and I suddenly heard Matsi. We called her Matsi, which means kitty in Bosnian. Matsi sounded like she was crying, and we thought she was in danger. Maybe she was hurt. And Dino and I ran in two different directions to look for her because she wouldn't come to us. And in that moment, the bomb fell and blew up to pieces four of our girlfriends. They died that day. So the very first day of bombing of my city would have been the day when my story ended if it were not for this refugee cat that saved our lives, which was the first of many extraordinary moments in my life during the genocide, and certainly a reminder that if I survive, that I'm obliged to share my story, even if it comes sometimes at a cost to me, because those friends that I lost that day and many others will never tell their story.
You do. And again, I would urge people, The Cat I Never Named, a true story of love, war, and survival. Professor Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, the book available everywhere and everywhere online. You can have it at any local bookseller, certainly any of the chain booksellers. It is available, and I highly recommend it. One of the things that I have learned, it was originally, I believe, pitched by the publisher to me as, and again, a YA, a young adult book. And what was interesting to me is, I'm sorry, Professor, we're on air. I know, but we're on air, and I want to. Interesting to me is I don't always, when I get a book like that, a novel, whatever, if it's nonfiction, I've always thought I was just a nonfiction reader. And then, I'd get novelists on occasionally. Your book, again, as a young adult book, I thought, well, I'm going to do the interview. Let me at least get into it, to do my homework, especially as a professor. Authors know when you did your homework or not. And I started to read it and read it and read it. And I would not stop. It was just, plenty of tears fell on the page. It's just such an amazing book. I've heard from so many listeners over the past couple of years, Professor, same experience. One of the first was a dad that reached out, that emailed me, and he said, I got the book for my daughter and wanted to encourage her. She was, I can't remember his exact words, not reluctant, but I thought, if I'll sit with her a little bit and we'll start. He said, I found myself, when she'd go to bed, picking up the book and reading. I couldn't put it down. I had to read more and more. And I've heard that so many times from adults, that I certainly agree 100%. This is, forgive me, it may be targeted to young adults, but it's for everybody. It is for everybody. I would, because it gives such insight. And of course, your writing style is so beautiful. It gives such insight. I've got to read this. You have in the book, the war didn't spring on me all at once. Instead, like a cat, it stalked me quietly. There might have been a rustle of leaves, a glint of golden eye, but like a mouse, I didn't believe it was there until it pounced.
It's true. That line captures my sentiment that, and I think a sentiment that many people who have gone through similarly extreme forms of violence feel, that it can't possibly happen. It can't possibly happen. Humans should not be capable of inflicting such an extreme form of harm, though there were all these signs along the way that pointed to us moving the red line, if you will, of what's acceptable to be said, or how Muslims in this case were depicted. And in many ways, I refuse to believe what became very obvious by the time that first day of besiegement in my city transpired. And I appreciate you sharing that this book is for everyone. I did write it for everyone, but I wanted to make sure that I also write the book that can enter classrooms, because it is a story that, while it's a story about my own lived experience, it's a story that really repeats itself through history. It's a story that many kids today in the United States are wondering, is it going to happen to them? And so it was a story that I offered as part of myself and my own experience, with the purpose of educating, whether an adult or a child. And I had to say, I also had Louis, adults write to me to say, oh, my child got this book assigned, and I see it's about the Muslim character, and I wanted to read it because I'm not comfortable with my child reading something about the Muslim and a character. And here I am, it's 4 a.m, and I can't put this book down. And I'm so sorry for the way I felt about someone like you. I feel a different kind of connection. And here I am now Googling, where's your hometown, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what happened, and how could I miss this genocide, and how could I not be aware? And so for me, that has been incredibly inspiring. Or a story of a pilot who retired from the US Army, who actually was one of the people intervening, or part of the intervention, when eventually the US decided to stop the war. It was 4 years, from my perspective, too late, because of the loss of life and genocide already being committed. But he said, I'm retiring, and I was wondering, what's the purpose of my life? Have I done anything through this service? I'm re-examining my life, and reading your story made me realize that if I saved one person, my life had meaning and purpose. So I've gotten reflection from a student who said, I don't like reading. I have a learning disability, but I'm in a difficult spot and I feel very depressed. This was during the pandemic, and someone gave him my book as an inspiration. He said, I never read a book. I never finished reading a book. I don't like reading. And here I am now. I started a semi-book club, reading your book to others who are experiencing difficulties. So for me, while it wasn't easy to share the most intimate parts of myself in the way that I did, in order to, with hope, to build this connection and evoke emotion in human beings, to now be on the receiving end of those types of reflections has been incredibly touching and humbling. I put myself out there, and I feel the story has been received in a way that made it all worth it. And I'm grateful to the Father that you reflected on his story, and each and every reader who connected with the story in the way that they did.
And by the way, I've got to tell you, I had someone in from our regional library a few weeks ago, and I was talking about you coming on and about your book. She said, "Oh, I love that book," and she deals, she's deals with a lot of YA books at the library. I've got to ask you if your story again about learning English. You are now a professor at Columbia University, and we'll talk about the Teachers College in just a minute. But I found that absolutely fascinating. I have retold that countless times about your dad, the dictionary, et cetera. Tell us, if you would.
So as the genocide was happening, we didn't have access to normal schooling, to TVs, to books. People were burning books for heating in some cases. And so I was in this environment where I wanted to resist this hate I was exposed to. And I did a lot of different activities where I worked with local nurses and doctors to go to the front lines and try to find children who needed to be immunized, just regular immunization that couldn't happen during the war. UNICEF sometimes would provide the shots, but then somebody had to take the immunization shots to risky areas. And I would do that even though I was only a teenager, because I didn't think that I would live for much longer. I really assumed that my life would end. The question was on what day, and the question was in what way. And I thought that for as long as I live, I I I should create some sense of purpose and meaning, not just for myself, but people around me. And one way in which I created a sense of humanity for myself was to continue to learn. And that was my form of resilience and resistance. And I was forced to study Russian in school because we were a communist country prior to the war. And what I realized during the war, that everyone who was in my school, everyone who was pushed to study Russian was actually non-Serbs, and that there was overrepresentation of Serbs in class that offered English. And so when the war started, I decided I would learn English. And so how would I do that? Then I started with my dad's dictionary. My dad had an old dictionary that
English dictionary. Yeah, sorry.
dictionary that he used. I think, to learn a couple of words in order to impress young women, girls of college age, when he was in college, that would come to the beach on the Adriatic coast. And that's how this particular English dictionary dated back to, I think, 1960s. And so I found it, and I decided I would memorize each and every word in the dictionary. The war, who knows how long it will be. And so every day I sat down and I memorized. I didn't know how to pronounce the words, but I memorized the writing of them and the meaning for each word. And that's how I started. And then actually in the midst of genocide, because a lot of teachers were killed or were on the front lines, I was asked by two different schools to help with teaching. And so I actually became teacher when I was still a teen. And my first group of students were fifth graders, and I was asked to teach them English. So here I am. I barely speak English myself, but due to lack of resources, I was asked to teach fifth graders. And I remember walking for the first time. I had to go through these cornfields to hide, to cross one of the main highways, very close. This particular school was very close to the front line, to avoid being shot. And I remember my muddy shoes and the fear, and sort of feeling that my heart is beating in my throat as I got to school to teach these fifth graders in the midst of genocide, something that relates to English while I'm learning myself. And so I remember the first sentence that I asked them, or assignment that I gave them, was to talk about what food we would like to eat, because we didn't have much to eat. So we talked about ice cream, and we talked about flavors of ice cream. So that was my first teaching experience. It was related to teaching English that I barely knew myself to these young individuals. But more importantly, it was about teaching hope and teaching resilience and teaching everyone how to smile. And not only those I was teaching, but also receiving, being on the receiving end of that hope by being in the classroom.
That's so beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, I am talking with Professor Amra Sabic-El-Rayess. Her book, The Cat I Never Named, A True Story of Love, War, and Survival. You've got a new book coming out in a year.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, April of 2024. This book is titled 3 Summers and will be published by Macmillan Publishers FSG. My editor, I have not shared this publicly before, and hopefully she'll be okay with me sharing this.
Hope so.
But when she read the first version of the manuscript, she said that this is one of the most beautiful stories she's ever read.
Wow.
It is about 3 magical summers that I experienced on the eve of the Bosnian Genocide in Bosnia on my family's property by the river, on the river Una, that runs through my hometown of Bihać, with 5 of my cousins, some of them coming from backgrounds where one of my uncles was a Serb. He was actually a military officer in the Serb army, and my aunt, who is Muslim. And during those summers, while we're living the most beautiful days of our lives, we are also exposed to the narratives of the adults that ultimately will culminate into the violence that followed several years later. And so it's about sisterhood. It's about love and my belief that we can ultimately overcome hate through that experience of connection with my cousins from diverse backgrounds during those 3 magical summers. We never came together again in life in the way that we did then. And so this is really reflecting back and showcasing the beauty of sisterhood to inspire, hopefully, that kind of connection with young adults, middle schoolers, and adults who might be reading it.
Where do you think that comes from in you, Professor? All that heart and that desire to share, and I'm going to help heal the world. Where does that? I know that's a difficult, maybe a challenging, I shouldn't say, question. Where do you think it? Where do you believe that comes from?
It comes from, there are many possible answers to that question, but I think ultimately it comes from realization that silence doesn't work, and that we all are seeking a sense of connection, belonging, recognition with our communities. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to evoke empathy. And by sharing, my hope is to model for those who are questioning whether their story is worthy of being told, to really send a message. Yes, each and every story is worthy of being told. I was told growing up that my story is not worthy, that I shouldn't tell my story, that I do not matter as a Muslim, that I'm not valued. I'm told that sometimes now. I don't. Yes, I've been on this pathway of what might be perceived as success and accomplishment. But unfortunately, anti-Muslim hate is still real, and is still something that I experience. And so simply uplifting humanity and stories that humanize people of diverse backgrounds is very important. It's in academic terms, I call it protective factor against hate. And so, as we know, if you go on Twitter, you can find all kinds of radicalizing extremist narratives inspiring hate against pretty much any group you can think of. But the way that we build resilience to hate is to actually build connection. If I respect and appreciate you, Louis, and I feel a connection towards you, it becomes that much more difficult for someone like me to in some way dislike you or hate you. And so that's ultimately my goal, and that's where I derive strength, because I've seen what the impact of that connection is to protect us from hate. And for that reason, I find the strength and desire to tell these stories.
That's absolutely beautiful. When you said, Professor, evoke empathy, sadly, there are people that do just want to evoke hate in others. One of the things that I've said for years is, probably said it to you last time, there are people out there that want to point the finger but fear the mirror. They want to say, instead of looking at themselves and doing some self-examination first, they want, it's these people or that one or that, they want to, and they fear the mirror. They point the finger, yet they fear the mirror. Too often. You break that down so beautifully in what you just said and your work. I know we've got limited time, but there's so many things. I've got so many notes already about that. I do want to talk about the Teachers College, Columbia launching the International Interfaith Research Lab to foster culture of resilience and understanding. And this, I still have, I'm not sure what date it was, but I think it was a year ago, maybe, or late last year. And now thriving and doing amazing work. Tell us about that.
So thank you for that question. I recognize that in academic circles we talk about often discrimination, bias, racism, stories of hate, but there are limited spaces where we have used storytelling and bringing communities together to prevent specifically targeted violence, which is what I focus on. Targeted violence, meaning targeting someone because of their faith, because of their ethnicity, because of who they are, because of their race, or any other aspect of their identity. And so we started this International Interfaith Research Lab with the goal of bringing faith communities, with the goal of bringing diversity across in all forms, to come for people to come together and for us to do research projects that will inform various initiatives that can lessen hate. So we launched it at the end of November of last year, and we, for instance, have already held a summit for all faith leaders in New York City. In partnership with Mayor Eric Adams, Mayor of New York City, to provide resources that would support mental health among faith leaders and educators in various faith communities. Because when a kid or a student feels isolated, marginalized, disliked, hated, bullied in school, they are likely to go to their mosque or their church or their synagogue and seek help there. And so it's very important that faith leaders, faith communities have also understanding of how hate emerges and what kind of supports they can lean on to make sure that when someone feels disliked or hated or bullied, that they actually support them in a way that they direct that energy into positive engagement in society. And so we brought hundreds of leaders to TC, to Columbia, to engage in conversations on mental health and violence and hate prevention. We also hosted a very, to me personally, very special initiative called the Journey of the Sarajevo Haggadah. Just for your audience, Haggadah is a Jewish manuscript used often during Passover. The Sarajevo Haggadah is a particularly special manuscript because for centuries, various forces have attempted to destroy it. So, for instance, during World War II, Bosnia was occupied by Nazi Germany, by its puppet state. Croatia was at the time a Nazi state, and so Croatia occupied together with Germans Bosnia. And this particular manuscript that was a Jewish cultural treasure, is a Jewish cultural treasure, was stored in the National Museum, and museum curator, who was a Bosnian Muslim, he was an Islamic scholar. He risked his own life to protect this book from a Nazi general that wanted to destroy it.
That's beautiful.
And during the Bosnian genocide that I survived, similarly, the entire museum was targeted with the intent to destroy this manuscript and destroy other cultural treasures. Because when genocide happens, it's not only about killing the living human beings, it is also about killing, destroying the culture, destroying the libraries, destroying intellectual history of a particular people. And so during the Bosnian genocide, again, it was a Muslim scholar who saved the Sarajevo Haggadah. And so we uplifted this story not only because of the cultural significance of the Sarajevo Haggadah, but also because of people of different faiths, and in particular Bosnian Muslims who risked their lives, even when genocide was being committed against Bosnian Muslims, to actually save the treasures of the Jewish people who have always coexisted with Muslims in Bosnia.
Always coexisted. I'm echoing you. Always coexisted with Muslims in Bosnia. I'm talking with Professor Amra Sabic-El-Rayess. You're listening to Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland, copyright B. Free Radio Limited 2023, produced by the Lovely Miss Moneyface in cooperation with White Rabbit Productions. Being U.S. Holocaust Remembrance Day, I see the tweet about there's going to be a moment of silence, candle lighting, honor, never forget the victims of the Holocaust, etc. Again, doing the kind of work that you're doing and educating people has got to feel very soul satisfying for you.
It is. It is not easy work emotionally. It is not easy work to work with the type of content that I engage with. I just had my doctoral students in class that I teach this semester on Saturdays because of just the schedule and other obligations. So I teach it on Saturdays, and I shared with them in class some of the interviews that we did with those individuals who have radicalized, for them to understand where hate comes from and how it evolves. And one of the students asked me the question, Professor Amra, how do you do this? How do you do this every day? But there is that sense of fulfillment, Louis, that drives me, which is when I see the impact, when people change, when they feel transformed through the work that we do. When we train educators, we now have trained more than 1,000 educators this year on through a program that we call Reimagine Resilience. That's actually available through Columbia to any educator in the United States. We've been able to obtain grants and funding from Department of Homeland Security, specifically Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, that has funded some of our work on preventing hate and violence. And so when I go into a school and work with educators, and I see the impact and the transformation that happens as the result of our engagement, it is incredibly inspiring. It takes a lot of work to get there, and we're traveling. My team and I are traveling all the time. We're going to West Virginia. In West Virginia, we're going to work with police officers, and we're going to train them on how hate emerges and what they can do to prevent it. So it is it's difficult work, but it's fulfilling work.
It's just amazing when you think about how you're doing what you're doing and how it's changing, literally changing the world. Literally. Opening hearts one at a time.
One at a time. I don't know if I'm changing the world. I think it's very generous of you.
Well, I can
one person at a time.
I can tell you from my perspective, Professor, that I believe you are. I know, and I'm not going to belabor it, but it's something that, the obligation to heal the world. And one might say, I can't do that. But you have the responses, of course, you have to make every effort to do what you can do and what you're doing. When you educate one person, they'll educate someone else. And it just continue that ripple effect. When you educate, especially, I shouldn't say especially. Yeah, I will say especially. I'm sorry, I start to argue with myself in my brain and sometimes out loud like that. You're educating people will pass that on. Certainly young people, and will grow with that. When you educating different groups of people, individuals, then they will continue that and reach out to others. And then again, that idea of hate prevention. Talk with us a little bit about that, Professor.
Well, it started with this idea that we can't expect educators and put the burden on educators in our schools to do something about the rise in polarization, hate, and the sense of what we call educational displacement. This is a term that we have developed by looking at how many students now feel in our schools. They feel a sense of displacement from their community, even if they're physically in schools. It doesn't mean that they necessarily are dropping out, but it's that sense of isolation, displacement, disengagement that often leads to problems such as violent behaviors. And so we started with this question of how does hate emerge? And it became clear that hate comes from hate-filled narrative, that hate is precursors to violence. So when you have hate narratives that are adopted in various spaces in our society, whether it's social media, traditional media, educational spaces, formal, informal spaces, Thanksgiving dinner tables, that feeds the actual act of violence. And how do you begin to change that narrative? You begin to change it through interventions in the classrooms. And you begin first with educators. I am an educator who educates educators at the Graduate School of Education. And so if we teach our educators only technical skills, and I started my career teaching statistics, so I know what's the value of technical skills.
Good for you.
But if you just stay with the notion of technical skills, but people have no understanding what power they have as an educator in the classroom to make a person feel a sense of belonging, or by contrast, a sense of displacement, we are not going to create a united society. America is extremely diverse. That's not going to go away. And so the real question for me is, how do we make sure that everyone, irrespective of their race, of their faith, or of any other aspect of their identity, has a sense of belonging? And that question has not been raised. There are many questions that have been raised in discussions in political narratives. Whose story should be excluded from the classroom so that my story could be included? That is not the work that we do. We are trying to figure out how do we engage the entire community in a way that everyone in the classroom and everyone who is an educator feels this is a safe space for me. I am seen, I am heard, and someone sharing their story does not have to make me feel that my story is displaced. That is our goal. It's a difficult goal, but we have seen success in all of the communities with which we have worked so far. Many of the schools that invited us one time keep inviting us again to train their educators. And now we have police officers who, initially our training was designed for educators, but now we have police officers who are reaching out to us and saying, well, we also need to understand how hate happens and how we can act preventively and what we can do. So we will keep doing that work for as long as there's need. I hope, Louis, one day we have an entirely different conversation, maybe about ice cream and lollipops and
And cats.
cats. I would love that. I would love that. But we as a society are not there yet.
I've got to ask you a quick question. Michael Russo asked, would you agree that genocide can be committed without killing people, but by destroying and wiping out the culture and traditions and history of people, leaving future generations detached from its culture, history, and traditions?
Yes, that would be cultural genocide by definition. And I always say that when genocide, and I think I might have mentioned already, when genocide is committed against a particular group of people, often it's coupled with this cultural genocide where, as is the case in Bosnia, 80% of the mosques were destroyed. For instance, now in parts of the country, in the Serb entity of the country, where kids are still learning from textbooks that celebrate the genocide committed, and where the sites often it were actually schools where mass executions of Muslims took place. They're being converted instead of being remembered and commemorated. The sites where victims lost their lives, where they were executed, are being converted into parking lots and so on. So that erasure of the history is a critical component of dehumanization that continues and can impact generations. That's why we talk about intergenerational trauma. So yes, I absolutely agree that genocide can be cultural in nature.
That I know you've got a split. Hopefully we can do another. I know you're really obviously you're really busy, but I would love to do the gig with you again, Professor. That's so enlightening. I want to say thanks to Jack at the shop around the corner. By the way, you can go to Sabic-El-Rayess.org. We've got these links up. We've got these links up into Teachers College, Columbia University, etc. I'm going to say I love you, Professor. I love you, Amra. You're amazing, and you are such a light in and for our world. I'm grateful to know you.
I am grateful to know you, Louis. I did different radio interviews, TV shows since you and I met first time, but I felt an instant connection with you. And I want to, thank you for being who you are, because people like you inspire me to do my work. Sometimes I'm tired. Sometimes my husband and children say, my people say, Mom, why don't you do something else that is not as difficult as what you do? But it is the goodness in people that I see and I choose to see. And you're one of those incredibly inspiring individuals, and your audience is lucky to have you,
You have them too.
who you are. So thank you. I love you. I love you very much, and I appreciate you inviting me back, and I appreciate your audience.
As long as I can, I will never stop. I will always continue. Let me put it as a positive, inviting you back, because of your amazing impact in our world and what you do. The Cat I Never Named: A True Story of Love, War, and Survival. Professor, thank you so much. Hopefully we can do it again soon.
Absolutely, we will. Thank you, Louis. Thank you so much.
Thank you. She is absolutely amazing, folks. I'm sorry I'm getting a bit emotional. I'm not sorry.